The Shadow Dragon by Andrea Pearson. Copyright 2017, Andrea Pearson. Dedication. To Madison, Ashlyn, Jaden, Preston, and Lillian. We love you. Chapter 1. Nick shoved his hands in his pockets, hating the feeling of eyes on him as he and his new friend Jessie walked away from the grocery store. As long as he didn't react to the people staring, they'd eventually grow accustomed to seeing him around. He was sure of it. He just hated the awkward and uncomfortable feeling that came from them watching. He and his mom had just moved to Geode City, a small town of only a couple thousand people in the middle of nowhere. School started soon, and thank goodness, summer had never felt so long in his entire life. He knew that he'd feel more at home once he got into the daily routine of assignments, classes, and teachers' lectures. Nick glanced at Jessie as she took a breath from talking about the town's history. "Where did the city get its name?" he asked. She pointed at the hill the city abutted against. "It's an active volcano. It spurts out geodes occasionally." Nick nodded. He'd already heard about the volcano and the occasional steam that issued from it. Jessie's talking resumed. She started telling him about the houses they passed, and he listened intently, eager to learn more. The farther they went, though, the more his brain muddled with all the information. He'd never remember anything. It wasn't possible, so he let his mind wander instead. He and Jessie had met in the town's only grocery store. His mom was the store's new general manager, the reason they'd moved here, and Jessie's mom worked in the deli. Jessie's dad was the sheriff of Geode City. Her chatter continued as they approached an old rundown manor that Nick had wondered about for a while now. Most of the houses in town were from the 1950s or later, but this one was obviously much older. It was also the biggest in the city. Its dark, imposing walls caught Nick's attention now, as they usually did, and he stared at the dead vines that grew all over the large stone. The entire place was completely overrun with old flowers and vegetation. "What about this one?" Nick asked, motioning at the manor with one shoulder. "Oh, that's Mr. Hardester's manor. He's been dead for ages." "Who owns it now?" "We don't know, actually. Probably some distant relative from some other part of the country. Nobody's come to it since he died, and the city won't go near it." Nick paused to face the manor, holding the fence's wrought iron bars and peering at the large yard and faded stone. "Why not?" Jessie stopped next to him, her body partially turned away from the large house, as if it made her uncomfortable. "Not sure. Dad says it's because it's private property. Mr. Hardester intimidated everyone in town, and nobody wants to do anything with the place." She stepped forward, obviously wanting to continue, but Nick hesitated. "Come on, let's go," she said. "I'll tell you about the robberies that have been happening." As daughter of the sheriff, Jessie heard things a lot faster than most people did. The cashier in the store had been talking about robberies with a woman several people in line ahead of them, but Nick wasn't close enough to totally hear what was being said. Jessie continued talking. "Have you heard about any of this already?" Nick shook his head, still not moving. "Not really. What's going on?" She surprised him by turning to face him, leaning her shoulder against the fence casually, as if she hung out near the manor all the time. Nick could tell from the expression on her face that she felt anything but casual. There've been 10 places targeted in as many days. No clear motive. She dropped her voice. "And what's really weird, the robbers are only stealing select items from each house." "What items?" Nick asked. "Bowls and spoons. Seriously, every single bowl and every single spoon. Also, DVD players and black and white movies." Nick tilted his head. Okay. That's really random. What sort of person would steal the bowls and spoons? And the DVD players, but not the TVs? Yeah, it's really got my dad worked up." She turned to gaze into Mr. Hardester's yard again, resting one hand on the fence. "But the weirdest thing," she said, "are the murders." "Murders?" Nick asked. "Great. Just great. Welcome to Geode City, Nick. He better not get targeted. Jessie nodded. Yes, murders. Not every house has had one. I heard Dad telling Mom that's because some of the houses have been empty when the robbery took place. But in every case where someone has been killed, their body was perfectly intact except for one part. She looked at Nick. Their eyes. They're shriveled up inside their heads. Nick grimaced. That's messed up. It freaked him out. How on earth did they get killed through their eyes? If that's the way it's happening. Jessie shook her head. I don't know. Dad doesn't know. Nobody does. Nick stared into the yard, pondering over this new bit of information. He loved mysteries and riddles and enjoyed figuring them out, but this was really weird. If the sheriff in town hadn't solved it with all the information he had access to, Nick wouldn't be able to either. They turned to leave, but something in Mr. Hardester's yard glinted, catching Nick's attention. What's that? Jessie squinted, peering in the direction Nick pointed. I don't know. What do you see? Nick wasn't sure. I'm going to find out. He grabbed the fence and tried to climb, but it was too tall, and his feet kept slipping down the vertical bars. Instead, he turned and headed toward the gate. Don't bother, Jessie called after him. It's always locked. Nick pushed the gate. It swung open, its hinges screeching loudly. He glanced back at Jessie. Apparently not always. Jessie joined him. Holy cow. I've never seen this place open before. Either way, we'd better not go in. Nick glanced at her and hesitated a moment before deciding to investigate anyway. Jessie followed cautiously. He walked toward the area where he'd seen the glinting light. When sunlight glinted off the object again, it didn't take long to find what he was looking for. He bent and picked it up, his brain tickling when a slight feeling of déjà vu rushed over him. Had he held this thing before? If so, when? It was a small pendant of a dragon. The metal was mostly black, but the creature's wings, horns, and claws were gold. He shifted it around, staring at it, and trying to figure out what had been glowing earlier. Nothing on it looked like it could possibly reflect light. He pocketed it, deciding to investigate it at home later. He would return the pendant tomorrow. You're actually taking it? Jessie asked. Nick shrugged. Only for a day. I'll bring it back tomorrow. I think I'll Google it and see if I can figure out what it is. Jessie snorted. It's probably just a cheap souvenir from a vending machine. She was probably right. But still, he needed to know for sure. They turned to leave, and Jessie started up her chatter again about the houses they were passing. Nick had a hard time paying attention, though. He couldn't stop wondering about the pendant now in his pocket. Chapter 2. That evening, Nick sat on his bed and stared at the dragon pendant. He shifted it, gasping when its eyes glowed for a moment. What the heck? He couldn't find anything about it online, and neither had his mom. Nick wished his dad was still alive. He probably would have known what the thing was and where it had come from. His dad was one of the smartest people Nick had ever met. Nick glanced at the picture of Dad on his dresser. The pain he felt when looking at it had slightly dimmed over the past 2 years, but he knew better than to think it would ever go away completely. Nick. Mom called down the hall. You forgot to take out the trash. Please do it before you go to bed. Pull the big can to the street too. The garbage truck comes tomorrow. Sighing, Nick got to his feet and tucked the pendant in his pocket again. He trudged into the kitchen, grabbed the garbage can, and pulled the bag out, replacing it with a fresh one. He tied off the old one, tossed it near the front door, then gathered trash from around the whole house. The place he and his mom had moved into was tiny. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen with a small dining room attached. Yes, there was a basement, but it was barely 6 feet tall. Soon, Nick wouldn't be able to stand upright in it. That was where they stored their extra stuff, holiday decorations, unused furniture, etc. Mom loved the house, and thank goodness too. It was the only thing she'd been able to afford when Dad passed away. But Nick still wasn't sure. Of course, he'd been super disgusted by how completely trashed it had been when they'd moved in. For the first several days, the only thing they'd done was scrub, spray, fix, and repair. Nick had been surprised when several neighbors volunteered to help out. Back in San Diego, he'd barely even known his neighbors. Once he finished grabbing all the trash around the house, he took everything outside, briefly admiring the thousands of stars visible. He couldn't believe how vast the night sky was here compared to San Diego. He glanced at the volcano as he pulled the big can to the street. He couldn't believe they'd actually moved to a place that had an active volcano in it. The usual trickle of steam wisped from the opening, fading quickly in the night sky. He and Mom had been worried about the volcano. Would it erupt and kill everyone around it? Until they learned that recently active really meant recently active for 300 years. Nothing had happened since it had awakened. Either way, they both had 72-hour kits ready to go, always in the car. Nick set the can against the curb where the truck could reach it, then wiped his hands on his jeans, remembering the dragon still in his pocket. He pulled it out to look at it. The moment he opened his palm, though, the pendant squirmed and he flung it away from him, wincing at the odd sensation of coiling scales and shifting wings. His mouth popped open. The pendant was swiftly growing larger. By the time it hit the grass 10 feet away from Nick, it was well over 10 feet tall. Moments later, it was bigger than his house. The dark blue, almost black dragon shifted, wings and tail coiling around it, and turned to face Nick. Bright yellow eyes gazed on him. Nick stumbled away, landing on his rear end, staring up at the huge thing. He scrambled to his feet and turned to run, but the dragon flipped him to the grass with its tail, then covered his mouth with a wing. A violent buzzing started in Nick's head, making him feel like his brains were about to explode. Heat flowed all over him, starting from his head, and he squeezed his eyes shut, squirming, trying to get out from underneath the wing and tail. What was happening to him? Was the dragon poisoning him? The buzzing faded away as quickly as it started. Stop trying to get away. I'm not going to hurt you. Nick froze. Where on earth was that voice coming from? From me. What? Nick asked out loud. Was the dragon really talking to him? Of course I am. Nick. It is here. And you must stop it. Stop what? The Argyll demon. What the heck does that mean? Nick's eyes widened as he stared up at the dragon, and he forgot his question. He hadn't noticed before, but the beast before him wasn't solid. He just assumed that the dragon was dark blue, almost black, but it was really made of shadow. What are you? He asked. I'm the guardian of space and time. Master of chronology. Huh? Nick, I control time and distance. I'm here to send the demon back, but you must help me. Send it back. What the heck was the dragon talking about? Yes. It has invaded your land, and will continue wreaking havoc unless it is stopped. Only I can stop it, but I need your help. The dragon released its hold on Nick, allowing him to get to his feet. Why me? Because you are the first who saw me. It is not easy to move when I am not in my dragon form, and that house has been forgotten far too long. It took me a week to get outside, once I realized no one would be entering. Where did you come from? From the volcano. It and Hardester Manor, linked to many places. Old Man Hardester explored things he ought not to have. He delved far too deeply into the caverns that surround the city and the volcano. Nick blinked. He'd only barely heard about Hardester Manor, and now he was getting a crash course on it and the man who'd lived there. The Argyll demon escaped its dimension through the volcano, but was injured in the process. An elderly woman took pity on it when she heard it moaning. She cared for it in her own home. Why the heck would she do that? She was confused and nearly blind. She heard its inhuman cries and thought it was a dog. Once she nursed it back to life, the beast turned on her and killed her. Horrible. Yes, indeed. It is now targeting the city, the place where she cared for it, and will not stop until it gets what it wants. What does it want? Something it can never have. Peace. Nick snorted. A demon that wants peace? Ridiculous. Be that as it may, it is the truth. How do we get rid of it, and how am I going to help you do it? The Argyll demon must be sent back to the dimension from which it came. Only I can do that. As guardian of time and space and master of chronology, my flames create a link to other dimensions. But I can only breathe fire once every year. We will have only one opportunity to send the demon back. Open your hand. Nick did so, and jumped when the dragon lurched toward him. The creature leapt into his hand, swiftly transforming back into a pendant. Nick barely even saw it happen. One moment, a huge shadow dragon was towering over him, and the next, the creature was gone, and the inanimate dragon was back in his hand. He stared at the pendant. Hello. Nothing happened. Okay, that was psycho. Nick turned to go back inside but gasped, looking down at his body. Something was totally wrong. He stretched his hands out, then stared at his legs. He was a shadow. Just like the dragon. How was that possible? Had the dragon done something to him? If so, what? The only thing the dragon had done was talk to him telepathically. But the pain that happened before that? Nick shook his head. If the dragon had somehow ruined him, he definitely wouldn't be willing to help find the demon. Nick glared at the pendant, then tossed it into the bushes by the front door. The moment it was no longer in his hand, his body solidified again, and he was back to his normal self. Whoa, he said. The change hadn't been permanent. And that meant the pendant gave him shadow powers. He could be practically invisible while holding it. He scrambled into the bushes and snatched up the dragon, grinning when his body turned into shadow again. This was seriously cool. He definitely needed to test it out. Nick sneaked around to the back of his house, standing just outside the kitchen window where his mom was cooking dinner. He waved his arms until he got her attention, then froze the moment she looked out the window. She stared, a perplexed expression on her face, then went back to cooking. Awesome, he whispered. Nick slinked back to the front yard, wondering where he could go to continue testing. He was about to head toward Jessie's house when the front door opened, spilling light on him. Oh, there you are, Nick, Mom said. What's taking so long? Dinner's ready. Come inside so we can eat. Nick shoved the pendant in his pocket. He'd have to remember that direct light undid whatever magic the pendant used on him. That was good to know. After dinner, Nick slipped through the front door and tossed the pendant at the grass, hoping to ask a few more questions. The dragon didn't come alive, though. Weird. Maybe it only shifted when it wanted to. Yet another thing Nick would need to keep in mind. Chapter 3. The next day, Nick met Jessie outside his house so they could head to the store again, something they'd been doing nearly every day since meeting. At first, it had been a little weird that Nick's only friend was a girl, but he enjoyed their conversations. He could tell she'd been lonely before he showed up. As they walked, he told her what happened the night before. She surprised him by believing his story. When he asked why, she waved it off, saying she'd always known their city was a crazy one. And it wants you to stop the Argyll demon? Did it say what that was? No, and I can't get it come back again. What does Argyll even mean? Jessie asked. I looked it up last night. It means clay. Jessie fell silent for several moments, rubbing her chin. Clay demon? What the heck is that? And what's going on right now that involves you and needs to be stopped? The only thing that comes to mind are those robberies. But what would they have to do with a demon and a dragon? Good question. Jessie was quiet and preoccupied for the rest of their time together, and Nick couldn't blame her. It was a lot to think about. They went home soon after their visit to the grocery store's lounge, where they ate junk food and hung out and talked while people watching. Chapter 4. Jessie's feet felt like lead the closer she got to her house. Argel demon. Argel demon. Argel demon. She thought it with each step. What was it? And was it really related to the robberies and murders that had been taking place? It had to be. There wasn't anything else the dragon could be referring to, and Geode City rarely had any crime, let alone murders. The town was freaking out. When Dad came home from work, Jessie overheard him talking to Mom about the robberies. His frustration spilled into his tone of voice and jerky movements as he paced his office, trying to predict where the next attack would be. Last night's had been bad. Apparently, 3 people were murdered. 15 minutes after dinner, he got called back to the station. While he was gone, Jessie sneaked into his office and found his list of the people who'd been attacked. Paper clipped to it was a map that showed where the murders had started, there on the edge of town, creeping closer to the middle of Geode City. The attacker targeted seemingly random houses and families, following patterns that didn't make sense. Jessie had lived there her whole life and knew pretty much everyone who owned the houses, and even she couldn't see a rational pattern, other than where the attacks started and were heading. She pored over her dad's notes, hoping he'd be okay with that. If the dragon was here because of the demon, and what else could the dragon be talking about, then she had information her dad didn't. Jessie couldn't approach him with that information unless she was sure, though. Everything on his desk was stuff she'd heard already. The attacks happened at night, and everyone who'd been targeted had lost a loved one sometime in the past. The only issue was, the murderers had completely passed on several people who had lost a loved one, so not all of them were being targeted. It seemed like the murderers were following another pattern that wasn't immediately visible. But what? Obviously, Dad knew about the losing loved ones pattern and had set up guards near the homes of people who matched, but in such a small town and so far away from other cities, they didn't have enough officers to guard everyone. By the time Jessie finished going over her dad's notes, the sun was setting. She leaned back in the big chair, resting her head against the hardened leather. Then she bolted upright, as something occurred to her. Nick's dad had passed away a couple of years earlier. His home was close to the last one that had been attacked. She had to get to him, and fast. Chapter 5. Nick pulled the dragon pendant from his pocket, holding it in his fist as he descended the stairs. Mom had sent him to get 2 cans of green beans while she ran to the store to buy chicken. He wanted to practice shadow stuff while he could. Poor Mom, she was so frazzled lately. Her work hours had been really crazy since getting the job, and they'd been eating dinner around 10. He knew it helped her feel better that they ate meals together. Nick paused at the foot of the staircase, hesitating as his body tingled and he turned into shadow. Then he slowly walked to the side of the room and melted against the wall, imagining himself sneaking around a great palace or the White House or something. He stuffed his hands in his pockets, pendant still in his fist, and pondered over the last day or so, ignoring the cold from the wall as it seeped through his tea. He still couldn't believe everything that had happened. He hoped the dragon would decide to return at some point and train him. He couldn't very well go up against a crazy demon without skills of some sort. The wall behind him shifted and moved, and he jumped away, his heart pounding in his chest. What the heck? He stared at the cinder blocks, barely able to see them in the darkness of the basement. Nothing was happening. Had he imagined it? Hide. That was the dragon. Nick knew he had to obey. He barely had time to stumble around to the back of the stairs before the blocks twisted and roiled, almost like boiling water, and something started pushing through from the other side. Mud puddled to the cement floor, dripping down the boiling cinder blocks, light from upstairs reflecting off the wetness. The mud continued coming faster and faster until the pile grew into something taller, just a bit taller than Nick, almost brushing the ceiling. It was dark brown. Legs and arms formed, along with a head that had huge horns on the side. Eyes protruded from the face and began glowing bright red. It gasped, and a large mouth with sharp teeth popped open. The glistening mud dried and hardened. Nick froze, holding as still as he could. Was this the Argil demon? It had to be. He fumbled with the pendant, trying to put it near the opening of his pocket so it could come alive. Had to stop the demon, had to send it back wherever it had come from. Nothing was happening with the dragon. The demon sniffed the air and growled, obviously having caught Nick's scent. "Come on," Nick shouted in his head. "Take care of this thing before it kills me." Realizing he risked catching the demon's attention even more, but not knowing what else to do, Nick tossed the pendant, hoping it would swell and turn into the real thing. The pendant clinked on the floor as it bounced several feet away from Nick. It rolled to a stop under a bag of onions. The dragon didn't appear. Crap! Nick slinked back farther under the stairs, hoping the darker shadows there would keep him out of sight for as long as possible. The demon growled, and Nick heard it take a step closer. His fresh scent let the demon know he'd been in the basement recently, but throwing the pendant had solidified his presence. Why hadn't the dragon appeared? Nick was about to get destroyed. He froze as the demon came around the back of the stairs and stared into the darkness at him. The demon said something in a different language and drew a symbol in the air that began glowing, lighting up the space. The Argyll demon reached for Nick. Nick's heart fluttered, and the wind in his lungs expanded, making him feel like his chest was about to burst. Then all the oxygen rushed out, leaving him feeling lightheaded. What was going on? Was this how the demon killed people? The beast stepped closer, almost blocking Nick's way out of the storage under the stairs. It spread its arms wide and began chanting. The symbol glowed brighter, and Nick's eyes began straining. Oh no! The light from upstairs dimmed considerably as someone stood in it. "Nick! Are you here?" It was Jessie. Her feet pounded on the stairs. "Don't come down!" Nick screamed. He lurched past the demon, somersaulting toward the onion bag, and grabbed the pendant. His body tingled, and he disappeared into the shadows, noticing belatedly that the demon's symbol died. Several things happened at once. Jessie burst into the basement, flipping on the light. The demon shielded its eyes, then roared, jumping away from Jessie. Nick held up the pendant, pointing it at the monster. With another roar, the demon dissolved into mud, plastering itself against the wall of the basement, seeping into the cracks and crevices between the cinder blocks. Only a second later, not even a speck of mud remained. Jessie slumped to the bottom step, dropping her face to her hands. "That was it. I knew it would come here next. I'm so glad I got here in time." "No kidding. Where's your mom?" "At the store." "Good thing. We don't have to explain anything to her." Nick nodded. He couldn't respond though. His legs felt weak and his hands started shaking. He sank to the step next to Jessie. "What now?" she asked. "That was the freakiest thing I've ever seen. What made it disappear?" Nick shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe seeing you come down the stairs? That is not the reason. Take me outside so I may converse with you." Nick jumped at the voice in his head, and that made Jessie jump too. "What's wrong? Is it coming again?" "No, the dragon wants to talk. Let's go." They raced up the stairs and out back, where Nick tossed the pendant. It grew, turning into a real dragon. Jessie shrieked, then laughed, hand on her heart. "Whoa! That seriously freaked me out." Nick smiled at her, before turning his attention to the dragon. "Was that the Argyll demon?" "Yes, it was." "Can you hear the dragon talking?" Nick asked Jessie. She shook her head. "No." "Okay, I'll relay the conversation. That was the Argyll demon we just saw." Jessie rolled her eyes. "Tell me something I didn't already know." Nick chuckled, turning back to the dragon. "And we're supposed to get rid of it?" "Yes. With my help." "I tried to get your help, but you didn't come. Because your basement is not large enough to house me." Nick passed the response on to Jessie, then tuned into the dragon's next comment. "The demon knows I'm here for him. You will not have the luxury of surprise on your side next time. Now that the demon knows I'm here, he will not come to you. You must find him." Nick felt the stress evaporate from his body. You mean the Argyll demon won't come back? Not to your house. Do not get complacent. He will probably increase his activities. Jessie grabbed Nick's arm. Ask the dragon how long the demon can survive above ground. Good question, little one. Nick frowned. Above ground? It will die if it doesn't go beneath the dirt after a couple of minutes. But don't think death will stop it. A new Argyll demon will be born from the rotted flesh and will continue terrorizing your town. I must send it far, far away. How did the old lady figure all this out without the demon dying? Nick asked after updating Jessie. She found the demon in her basement and dragged it upstairs. The demon worsened immediately, so she pulled it downstairs and kept it there. And she thought it was a sick dog. Didn't she wonder how a sick dog got in her basement? Jessie grabbed Nick's arm. What is the dragon saying now? How did it answer my question? As soon as Nick finished relaying the conversation to her, she clapped her hands. I know what's going on. She grabbed Nick by the arm again. The demon targets people who have lost loved ones. Your dad died, that's what made me think to come here. But it's called an Argyll demon for a reason. Unless it's underground, it doesn't survive long. Nick nodded, seeing where she was going. We need to find out if the other victims have had basements. Without saying goodbye, the dragon turned back into a pendant, and Nick pocketed it. He and Jessie practically jogged inside, talking excitedly while Nick started cooking the green beans. His mom got back soon after, and their conversation changed accordingly, but the energy was still there. Nick was so glad he had Jessie on his team. Not only was she smart, but she was the sheriff's daughter and had experience, even if only through her dad, with these sorts of things. They'd get it figured out. Chapter 6. First thing the next morning, Jessie invited Nick over. She hoped her dad would be open to talking to them about the case. He had been in the past. He liked running problems by her mom, and Jessie had been there for a few of those conversations, but she wasn't sure this time since it would be just her and Nick. The two eagerly explained the new pattern to her dad, and he thanked them, then asked them to go play while he made a few phone calls. Guess that means we've been dismissed, Nick whispered in the hall next to Dad's office. Jessie made a face. He must have been really distracted. Go play? How old does he think we are? Nick chuckled, which annoyed Jessie, but she tucked the exasperation aside. Let's watch a movie, she said. I'll keep an ear on my dad's study in the meantime, and the minute he comes out, we'll be there. Nick agreed, and they crossed the hall into the family room. Jessie had a hard time concentrating, though, and 20 minutes in, she didn't even recognize the movie they'd chosen. Finally, an hour later, Dad stepped out of his office, rubbing the back of his neck. Jessie jumped up to meet him in the hallway. Well, she asked. He released his breath in a big, exhausted rush. Seems you're right. The homes have all had basements. And the places that matched the lost loved ones category were skipped when they didn't have one. How did you figure it out? Jessie thought as quickly as she could. It just popped into my mind. I was looking at your map and realized Nick's dad had passed away, which meant he might get targeted. So I ran over there and I think the robbers got scared away. She didn't really answer his question. She cringed inwardly, hoping he wouldn't realize it. Dad gripped her shoulders, staring at her. Jessie, that was very dangerous. You should have called me. I know. I'm sorry. Dad shook his head. You can't ever do that again. Please let me take things from here on out. You know I can handle it. With what you've figured out, I'll be able to make sure these murderers are apprehended. Jessie chewed the inside of her cheek. How could she possibly obey her dad while still helping Nick? She knew her friend would have to be the one to stop the demon. There was no way her dad could. He had no idea what he was up against. And she wouldn't let Nick go stop the demon on his own. Dad hadn't finished, though. Promise me you won't sneak off to other people's houses, even if you think it might save them. You call me first, let me handle it. Please? Jessie nodded. Her dad was exhausted. The lines on his face were much deeper than usual, and his eyes were tired and bloodshot. He was on his last thread, and the terror he must have felt thinking he'd nearly lost his daughter had obviously made things worse. "I promise. And you'll let me know if you think of anything else? I'm not too proud to recognize when one of my children has a genius idea." "Yeah, definitely." Jessie hugged her dad, then returned to Nick. "We were right," she whispered. "They've all had basements." She slumped into the couch, then tucked her legs up against herself and tightened her arms around them. "I promised him I wouldn't try to save anyone else. And I won't." She lowered her voice. "But that doesn't mean I'm not going to try to stop the demon in its own hideaway." "Are you sure?" Nick asked. "It'll be dangerous." "Positive." Nick blew out a breath. "Good. 'Cause I'm going to need help." He pulled out his phone, opening the Maps application. "Show me where the first attack happened." He handed the device to her. "I have a plan." Chapter 7. They separated for lunch, then met outside Nick's house in the early afternoon. Jessie hadn't slept well the night before, and though it was the middle of the day, her eyes were still burning. She rubbed them, waiting for Nick to meet her on the sidewalk in front of his place. Jessie had everything they would need. A map of the city, information on each of the houses, snacks and water, and she'd also written down everything the dragon had told them. It took 20 minutes to get to the first house. As they walked, Nick told her his plan. They'd search for the demon during the day, when it was hopefully sleeping, then would return at night when the shadow dragon could help get rid of the beast. Nick figured it still lived in the house where the old woman had cared for it. Jessie wasn't so sure. She'd pointed out that cops had been in and out of the house multiple times, and the demon would have been forced to find another place to live. She could tell this had already occurred to Nick. "Regardless," he said, "we need to look at this from every angle." Which means seeing if the demon is there, as well as familiarizing ourselves with where the demon once lived. Jessie thought that was a good idea. The home was still covered in police tape, and it was evident nobody had been there for a while. Jessie produced a key to the place. She'd found it in her dad's study, and Nick's jaw dropped. "Does your dad know you have that?" he asked. Jessie shook her head, pushing away the feelings of guilt that twisted her stomach. "I've never taken anything from him before. We have to get it back as soon as we can, because I don't know when he'll need it next. The faster we figure out what we need to know here, the better." Nick agreed, and after making sure nobody was on the street, Jessie let them into the house. Her eyes widened when she surveyed the living room. This had to be where the elderly woman had lived. Doilies were everywhere. Little porcelain figurines lined multiple shelves, and needlepoint artwork hung on nearly every square inch of the walls. What surprised Jessie, though, was what they found in the basement. There were a ton of bowls and spoons scattered across the floor, not enough to have been the stolen cash, but obviously ones the demon had collected. They also found a TV, a very nice one, hung on one wall, and surrounded by several DVD players and hundreds of black and white movies. "Here's what I'm guessing," Nick said. The old lady and demon watched old movies while she nursed him back to health with something served in a bowl. Chicken noodle soup, or whatever. And this is a stretch, but maybe their DVD player didn't work all the time, so he's now got this compulsive need to steal them from other people. Jessie gave him a skeptical expression, and he raised his hands defensively. "It's just a theory. The TV's obviously perfect, no scratches or dings on it." Nick paused, then gave her a smug expression. "The dragon just told me I'm right." "That's cheating," Jessie said with a grin. "All right, let's keep going. Maybe we'll figure something else out while we're here." They examined all the walls in the basement, but didn't find anything that gave them new clues to the demon's current whereabouts. No holes in the basement walls leading to tunnels. Jessie hadn't expected them to. Not when the beast traveled through the ground. But still, she'd hoped to learn something more than the fact that the creature wasn't great at organizing. Nick hesitated near a picture of the nearby volcano. Are there volcanic tubes here? Jessie glanced at him. You mean places where lava used to flow? Tunnels. He nodded. Exactly like that. Yes, tons. Not underneath the city, it's almost completely solid volcanic rock, which is why some houses don't have basements, but bordering the town, there are a ton of them. We played in them all the time growing up. Nick glanced at her. The demon is living there. Jessie scoffed. No way. Hundreds of people explored them every day, until the biggest one caved in. When did it cave in? 2 weeks ago. And when did the robberies start happening? 2 weeks ago. No way, she said, repeating herself. It's a coincidence. Nick raised an eyebrow at her. Believe what you want. I think the demon caused the cave-in to keep people out. Jessie snorted. It won't keep people out forever. If anything, it'll make it more exciting. Maybe the demon doesn't care. Maybe he wanted time to set up camp, and will now kill anyone who comes. Okay, fine. We'll explore there next, see what we find. Jessie didn't want to admit it just yet, but Nick's idea had to be correct. It was too much of a coincidence. Realizing they wouldn't find much else in the house, the two friends returned the key to Jessie's dad's study, then separated for the rest of the afternoon. In order to send the Argyll demon away, they needed to be able to use the shadow dragon. But the shadow dragon only worked at night, and nighttime was when the demon was out attacking innocent people and robbing them of their cherished black and white movies. Jessie hoped they'd be able to stop the beast before more people were murdered. Chapter 8. Right at 3:30 in the morning, Nick's alarm sounded. He hit the off button before it woke up his mom. If all went well, he and Jessie would be back in bed long before anyone missed them. He quickly dressed in dark clothes, making sure several times that he had the dragon pendant in his pocket, then he double-checked that he had all his gear. Luckily, his backpack was a dark color. Just in case they were gone longer than a couple of hours, he and Jessie had decided to bring a supply of food, water, flashlights, matches, and other sorts of things that would keep them alive if it came down to it. Jessie was already out front when Nick slipped through the door. She was dressed in dark clothes, her light hair covered by her hoodie. Ready? She asked. Nick nodded. Yes. Let's go. They set off toward the volcanic tunnels, the bright moon overhead giving them plenty of light to see by. Jessie had explained that the local government was trying to turn the tunnels into a state park, but it hadn't happened yet, and they were still open to the public 24 hours. Thank goodness. He wasn't in the mood to add breaking into a state park to his growing list of indiscretions. Show me how the shadow dragon works, Jessie said as they passed the place where the cave-in had happened. They decided to bypass it completely and start farther up the line. Nick nodded. He pulled the pendant from his pocket, half expecting it to turn into the full-size dragon. It didn't, though. It doesn't come alive often, only twice now. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's conserving energy. It might take a lot of effort. Good point. Nick stepped into the shadow of some nearby Joshua trees, feeling his body tingle as he faded from sight. That's so cool. He chuckled. I know. Do you think it would work for me? Nick shrugged. It's worth a try. Here. He handed her the pendant. Nothing happened though. Dang it. Jessie handed the pendant back, and he almost pocketed before having an idea. Take my hand. Let's see if the power can transfer. She did, but her outline only smudged a little. She was still much more visible than Nick. It sort of works, but we'll have to be extra careful, he said. Make sure you're always in a better hiding place than me. Jessie nodded. Let's keep going. It's not far now. 10 minutes later, they reached a narrow, craggy hole in the ground. Jessie explained in a whisper that the part of the entrance that had caved in had been a huge gaping hole. Apparently, so many people had come and gone from it that they'd smoothed a path in the volcanic rock. Here, though, they didn't have the luxury of a trail to follow. Instead, they were forced to carefully lower themselves down. It wasn't as hard as Nick expected it to be. The opening was the narrowest part, and soon, they lowered themselves to the massive tunnel below. Nick wiped his hands on his jeans, unable to believe what he was seeing. The shaft was magnificent, huge. It was more of a cavern than a tunnel. The dragon would have no problem turning into a living being there. It didn't take long for them to discover that any noise they made echoed on and on through the massive cavern. They did their best not to stumble or talk as they started forward. Not far into the tunnel, Nick realized a mistake they'd made. They should have come here during the day, rather than waiting for nightfall, so they would know exactly where the Argyll demon lived. Neither of them was comfortable turning on a flashlight, and even though the moon was bright overhead and there were several holes in the ceiling letting in its light, it was still rough going and very dark. Nick worried as their trip began to take much longer than expected. He didn't want to risk checking his phone. The light would ruin his night vision and might alert the demon to their presence. Where was it anyway? What if his intuition had been way off? What if the demon didn't live here after all? He waited for the dragon to confirm that what he'd felt earlier was correct, but no thoughts other than his own entered his mind. "Thanks," he thought sarcastically. They'd been traveling for at least half an hour when Nick heard something large shuffling behind them. He and Jessie met eyes and scrambled to get off the trail and behind a large boulder. Nick took Jessie's hand just in time. A slight light flickered into view, filtering off the walls of the cavern. Nick frowned, holding perfectly still, hoping the light wouldn't touch him. If it did, their cover would be blown. Was this the demon? And if so, why was it carrying a light? Didn't it see better without one? It is awake at night, but that doesn't mean it can't use light. Nick rolled his eyes to himself, but decided not to comment on the fact that the dragon responded to his thoughts now and not earlier. The demon strode into view, holding an old-fashioned lantern with a little fire flickering inside. The light wasn't strong enough, and instead of putting the demon into better view, it cast weird shadows across the cavern and put the demon's face in almost complete darkness. Nick held his breath, keeping perfectly still as the demon passed their hiding place. He felt Jessie's hands start sweating, or maybe it was his. Either way, they were both freaked out. Once the Argyll demon had gone far enough ahead of them, the two friends looked at each other, then quietly followed, maintaining at least a 50-foot distance. The demon was noisy, growling and making weird sounds and mumbling to itself. Nick and Jessie crept along the edges of the cavern. It was rough there, without a trail to follow, and they had to go around or climb huge boulders frequently. At one point, Nick stepped in a puddle, and the demon paused at the sound, staring in their direction. Nick held tightly to Jessie's hand, scarcely daring to breathe. The demon stared long enough for Nick to be positive it knew they were there. He could practically hear his heartbeat as he waited for the demon to decide whether to investigate. Finally, the demon turned and continued onward. He wasn't as noisy this time, though, and Nick and Jessie glanced at each other again. Had they ruined their chance? Put themselves into a dangerous and stupid position? Did the demon know they were following? There was nothing they could do but keep following. If they turned back when the demon suspected they were there, it might follow them and kill them in their houses, along with their families. Either that, or it would run and they'd never find it again. They had to get rid of it now. After about 15 minutes, the demon stopped in a small cavern and hung the lantern from a hook in the wall. Nick bit his lip, staring at the size of the cavern. It wasn't nearly big enough for the dragon. They'd have to lure the demon out. But how? Nick and Jessie crept along the edge of the big tunnel, going slowly and quietly, finally entering the smaller one. The demon was on the other side of a huge boulder, surrounded by all sorts of DVD players, movies, bowls, and spoons. It was rummaging through everything, organizing his spoils, talking loudly to itself in some strange language. Nick hadn't noticed, but the demon carried a very large bag, and it upended that now, spilling bowls, DVDs, and spoons everywhere. It began sorting through the new stash. "I'll lure it out," Jessie whispered so faintly that Nick had to watch her lips closely to understand. Make a ton of noise. He nodded. I'll come after and release the dragon. Just as Nick ended his whisper, the demon fell silent. Nick and Jessie looked at each other, the fear Nick felt mirrored in Jessie's eyes. Had the demon heard? Was their cover blown? Nick wished he could turn and investigate, but he didn't dare. Even a shadow was visible if someone was looking right at it. They waited for several seconds. Nothing happened. Nick blew out a quiet breath of relief, knowing the sound wouldn't reach the demon's ears. Jessie gave him a shaky smile and turned to leave. Just as she took a step toward the larger cavern, the demon jumped at them and grabbed Jessie, throwing her aside. Then he rounded on Nick. Nick darted under the demon's arms, tripped over a rock, rolled, and sprang to his feet. He raced past Jessie. She was out cold, blood trickling down her forehead. He had to save her, had to get the demon to forget her. The demon chased Nick, but only to the edge of the smaller cavern. It obviously remembered he had the dragon, and Nick would have to taunt it out. Was that possible, though? Would the creature take the bait? He jumped back and forth, making faces at the demon and yelling insults. You stupid thing. Come on. Get me. You've tried already, but you failed. You failed completely. I've got all sorts of DVD players and black and white movies at home. I've even got a ton of bowls. The demon hesitated, staring at Nick, then laughed. It said something in that gravelly language, then turned away, heading farther into the smaller cavern. Oh crap. Jessie. No longer needing help hiding in the shadows, Nick tossed the pendant, sensing as the dragon swelled to life. He jumped across the distance between himself and the demon, racing around the side and to the front of the beast. The demon had reached Jessie and was writing something in the air above her. Nick stopped, glaring at the demon. Leave her alone. You've terrorized this city far too long. The demon laughed. Oh. And what are you going to do about it? Nick blinked, momentarily surprised to hear English. He pushed his surprise aside though, and with a growl, charged at the beast and tackled it, using the momentum to force the demon back out into the larger cavern. The demon roared and turned, trying to scurry back to safety. But it was too late. The dragon flamed, and an explosion rocked the cavern walls. With a lurch, the air in the cavern started spinning, sucking the wind out of Nick's lungs. Rocks and sand filled the air, pelting both Nick and the demon. The demon grabbed at Nick, trying to pull itself away from the point where all of the wind was converging. Nick kicked at it, scrambling out of reach. Using the claw at the tip of its wing, the dragon hooked the demon, holding it in place. Run, the portal will suck you in too, and I won't be able to stop it. The wind rushed around Nick, tugging at his hair and clothes. He couldn't get to his feet, the gale was too strong. A spinning vortex of debris appeared, deepening and lengthening until a portal formed, showing a land of mountains and ancient trees. Nick watched, eyes wide, as the demon swirled, disappearing through the portal. Nick tried to get to safety, but he couldn't move. His foot was stuck at the edge of the vortex, and the force of the wind had begun pulling him closer to the portal. I can't move, he shrieked at the dragon. He couldn't gain traction. All of the rocks he grabbed were too light to hold his weight. Help me! Nick screamed, but it was too late. The dragon had already turned back into a pendant. Why had it deserted him? Can't maintain shape. Too much energy. Nick couldn't even respond. Panic overwhelmed him. He raked his fingers through the volcanic sand, ignoring the pain that shot down his hands as he tried to grip something, anything. He was getting sucked along too quickly. He looked behind himself. The portal was closing, but he was still being pulled toward it, and much faster now. He wouldn't be able to get out. He couldn't even get to his feet, not with one of them stuck in the vortex. Just as his other leg got caught, Jessie appeared. She grabbed his arms, pulling as hard as she could. Her hands slipped and Nick jerked backward. Help me, she screamed. Use your knees. Nick obeyed instantly. Forcing his legs to bend, He pushed against the ground at the edge of the vortex while Jessie kept pulling. He moved a fraction of an inch away from the portal. Jessie screamed, Nick screamed. His jeans were getting tattered from the friction of wind and dirt. He refused to think about how the skin on his legs looked. With a mighty roar, Nick pushed down hard on his knees, and Jessie yanked hard on his arms, nearly pulling them out of their sockets. Sweat mixed with blood dripped down her forehead, and her face was red from the effort. She yelled again, pulling harder, and Nick's other leg popped out of the portal again. With Jessie pulling, he was able to get his free foot underneath him to use as leverage. He felt as the portal started closing around his ankle. The wind increased exponentially. He could no longer hear Jessie's screams. Nick met eyes with Jessie. Her face was even redder now, her eyes watering. He watched as she took a deep breath and heaved again. At the same time, he pushed as hard as he could with his other foot. A great sucking noise sounded, louder even than the wind, and his leg popped out of the portal. The swirling vortex died, dirt and rocks falling all around them. Jessie whimpered, and the friends collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. Nick couldn't believe how close he'd gotten to being sent to the demon's dimension. "I never want to do that again," he said. Jessie didn't respond, but she squeezed his hand. When Nick and Jessie finally caught their breath, they got to their feet. Nick wasn't surprised to find he'd lost his shoe and sock. He did a quick switch, putting his sock on the foot that didn't have a shoe. Then the two of them looked around. The light from the demon's lantern somehow was still there, shining from the smaller cavern. Maybe the wind was magical, and hadn't gone beyond where the portal had formed. Nick ran to get the lantern, turning it all the way up as he returned to Jessie. They searched for several minutes, but even though Nick had seen exactly where the pendant had fallen, it wasn't there any longer. "I guess it finished what it was supposed to do," Jessie said. Nick nodded, but didn't respond. The next afternoon, Nick met Jessie at her house. They sat underneath the huge shade tree in her yard to talk. She'd ended up getting stitches, but was fine otherwise. "I told my dad we found the robber's lair. He and his deputy have been there all day, but haven't found the robbers or anything that would trace back to them. I highly doubt they will." Nick chuckled with her, then leaned back against the tree trunk. "Next time I want to go after a shining thing in the grass of an abandoned manor, stop me, would you?" Jessie laughed in response. "Don't worry. I will." Would you like to gain access to exclusive audiobooks only available to members of Andrea's Readers Group? Click the link in the description to learn more.